Chapter 11 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. Experts on Terror. Looking in the Mirror. After reading hundreds of books and articles and listening to scores of speeches and interviews by experts on terrorism and terrorists from the US, Canada, Israel, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and South Africa, I have come to the conclusion that there are recurring patterns. They use a common language to describe their subjects and their environment. They're extremely ideological under a thin veneer of scientific jargon. They possess a keen sense of selective observation. They always pretend to possess a psychological understanding, though few, if any, have dealt close up with their subjects in any clinical sense except perhaps under conditions of incarceration and interrogation. Their style is righteous, highly moralistic, vitriolic, given to hyperventilation, and yet facile with euphemisms to describe the violence of their partisan states. Their analysis is almost always filled with highly charged personalistic/individualistic invective, and views their subject as devoid of any political motivations. This psychobabble provides a legitimate sounding channel for expressing deep-seated hostility, a method for assuming a posture of civilized superiority in the face of their dehumanized subjects. The dehumanization process is central to the whole terrorist political academic enterprise, for the purpose is to present the terrorists as the one with no redeeming features, with no place in the world, no time for affection, in other words, worthy of physical extermination. The terrorist experts are the setup people. They motivate the colonial and imperial conquerors and reinforce their idea that the terrorists are not worthy of ruling or being ruled in regions of wealth or even of living in any territory contiguous to civilized or chosen people. The terrorist experts project the violence of their rulers, their conquistadorial ambitions, their greed to seize land and resources, and their savage destruction impulses onto their victims, while the responses of the victims, the survivors, are clothed in the rhetoric of pathological behavior. The really clinical pathologies are to be found, however, in the minds of the verbal assassins, who cannot decipher the casual relation between the repeated rapes and tortures committed by their patron states and the desperate cries and attempts at self-defense of the excluded, displaced, and exploited, or arrive at any appropriate moral conclusion. Almost all the terror experts have a chronic psychological blindness to the systemic and comprehensive violence inflicted by the West and Israel on particular groups. Today it is the Arabs. At other times it is all insurgents who respond to imperial violence with violence. The all-pervasive practice of torture is a means of breaking and converting militants and then infiltrating resistance movements. This interrogation method receives ideological justification and moral support from the terror experts. In their writings, insurgents or terrorists are described as beyond the human pale, as subhuman, in a trance. Their leaders are described as cynical profiteers and manipulators who have no human value or goals. Their communities are lawless pockets. Once committed to the cause, the merits of which remain unacknowledged, undiscussed, they know no law, no justice, only death, murder, and martyrdom. They live in failed states. They have no history or culture, or at least one inferior to Western Judeo-Christian civilization. In a word, the world will be better without them. To the torturer, this means his or her work is in the best interest of civilization. The terror experts are offended when the practitioners of torture are exposed, their handicraft of brutality photographed and published throughout the world's media. The terror experts are grieved not for the acts of moral degradation, but because it confirms what the terrorists have been saying, that they revolt out of the outrage and humiliation they suffer at the hands of their US, Israeli, European torturers, soldiers, mercenaries, and bosses. Terror experts protest at the public exposure. The dirty secrets absent from their analysis have become public knowledge and raised the specter of casualty. After all, They had attributed feelings of anger and humiliation to the purported personality disorders, childhood or family or cultural religious dysfunctions of the terrorists. The statements of the terror experts become less convincing in the face of publicized facts of physical humiliation by the armies and states of the purported civilizers. The terror expert genre. A lead article published in the Weekend Financial Times by Professor Jessica Stern titled "How Terrorists Think" is emblematic of the terror expert genre. Stern is identified as a lecturer at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and the author of a recent book, Terror in the Name of God: Why Religious Militants Kill. Published in the most prestigious business newspaper employed by a leading elite private university, with a book edited by a major publisher, Stern has all the right credentials to be regarded as a terror expert rather than a propagandist. The terror experts operate and see themselves on two levels, as scholarly researchers and as political prosecutors and security advisors. As, quote, experts, their work is of dubious quality, despite the self-declared wealth of sources they claim to have consulted. Many of the alleged terrorists were interviewed in jail, where they most likely had been tortured and drugged. The conversations would have been monitored. They hardly enjoyed the minimum conditions required to give a fair interview. Even so, the terror expert can be expected to edit out any excerpts that provide a political context for their actions, as their psychology-based methodology requires that they seek a subtext, which ipso facto renders the actual text irrelevant. They are likely to pay more attention to their own jaundiced impressions of how the terrorist looks, speaks, or listens, usually fixing on their own preconceived meanings of particular facial expressions or body movements. The terror experts excel in selecting the worst-case sample as representative of the leadership of the terrorists, the boastful, the money grubber, the affluent. They omit the norm of persecuted resistance fighters who are modest, sacrificing in solidarity with their people, upon whom they have many times to depend for food, medical care, and refuge. They omit the fact that there are highly educated, quote, fundamentalist Muslims who in every way pursue modern science-based professions, use Western critiques of colonialism and imperialism, who find it compatible to seek self-determination, majority rule, and practice their religion. There are also fundamentalist Muslims who are pietistic, seeking solace in spiritual practices, living in a narrow circle of work, mosque, and family, who have experienced the violent disruption of their pietistic life and respond not only because the imperialists have transgressed the sacred, but because they have destroyed the family network and intergenerational codes of existence. Such pietistic Muslims avoid political engagement until their intimate human and spiritual circle is violated. In the midst of the chaos, violence, dislocation, pillage, and occupation of a country, a whole people are adversely affected. As they reach out to respond, to protest, to survive, they seek movements and institutions that have some resources, a modicum of power. In the past, there were powerful nationalist, socialist, and communist parties, dynamic trade unions, and peasant movements. In a few countries, these are still active and a force to be reckoned with. In many regions, however, they have been decimated by U.S. client regimes, local secular or religious dictators, and by the disintegration of the communist parties. Under harsh conditions requiring clandestine activity and mass support, many secular activists have joined politically oriented religious movements, which embrace anti-colonial and anti-imperialist and social welfare programs. The catalyst for secular conversion to Muslim-inspired movements is politics, not religion. Leon Trotsky once advised his followers during the Nazi occupation of Europe that it might be necessary to join the Catholic Church if that was the only space available for political action. Given the mass base of the Muslim movement, given its engagement in the anti-colonial struggle, it is no surprise that many secularists, who may be leftists, nationalists, and Democrats, have joined these movements and may later turn to other political movements. To subsume the rich mosaic of resistance fighters to one ideological formula because of formal affiliations, as these terror experts do, is an egregious error. They're eager to prescribe a general repressive solution to the terror problem, truckling to the political interests of their paymasters and the big foundations or state apparatus. They repress inconvenient complexities, diverse motivations, conjunctural convergences between secular and spiritual. Terror experts evoke the emotive phrase Islamic fundamentalist terrorists to end debates and consider analysis that might require the public to reconsider their support for imperial wars and Israeli conquests and their opposition to Iraqi nationalists and Palestinian resistance fighters. Interrogation: questions for the terror experts. Terror experts claim that objective conditions, or what they refer to disparagingly as, quote, exploitation, quote, oppression, or, quote, imperialism, predictably always with quotes, are only a veneer covering some deeper personal need. The terror experts then proceed to unmask the true motives with a stream of psychobabble. In fact, the resort to crudely conceived and applied psychological categories is the principal method that the terror experts use to suppress the objective world, which impinges on their interpretation of the action of the resistance fighter. The external world in which violent resistance movements emerge is, by any measure, very hostile. The US and Israel, for example, are recognized the world over as very aggressive, non-normative actors, considering themselves unaccountable to any and all international laws. The terror expert can avoid this fundamental fact impinging on the resistance fighters' behavior by focusing on their supposed inner world and immediate face-to-face relations. This allows the terror experts to avoid the unpleasant aspects of their own state loyalties, the primitive tribal, clan, ethnic, religious, colonial, imperial loyalties which underlie their veneer of respectability, their phony defense of civilization and humanity. The terror experts were horrified by the photos of US torture in Iraq, not the acts. The revelations unmasked the savagery of their accomplices, the practitioners of their prescriptions, the whole underworld of crime and punishment that is logically derived from the totalitarian pseudoscience of the terror experts. It brings the terror experts of Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Johns Hopkins closer to the savage scenes of rape and mass sequential genital violence. The terror experts, of course, strike a pose of indignation towards the brutal guards, interrogators, the military commanders. They are silent as their current paymasters are pilloried, Rumsfeld, Bush, knowing full well that the next president will also employ their services. In any case, who is going to look deep and far from the scenes of torture and identify the torture accomplices among the torture experts? The torture experts simply pronounce their diagnosis of the armed resistance fighters: incurable psychopaths, extremely dangerous when at large. The politicians dictate the commands: capture, confine, torture, or kill. The special forces break through the doors in the middle of the night, cut throats, or take prisoners. The prison commandants establish the rules of interrogation. The guards torture. This is very coherent international division of labor in which the torture experts play an important part in elaborating the rationale. They ply a morally and scientifically justified war unto death of the Untermensch, the inferior peoples, the fundamentalist Arab Muslims, the suicide bombers, the terrorists. A common language is spoken between the terror experts and their state patrons, and then promoted in and by the mass media. Here are some questions for the torture experts. First, why do the imputed terrorists' personal needs find expression through politics, and not in 1,001 personal, familial, cultural, socioeconomic, or civic channels? Why do the terrorists' personal needs find expression against a certain enemy, the dominant power, rather than a host of other more direct objectives, which might be less dangerous and easier to access? Why do the terrorists' personal needs express themselves in favor of a particular group, family, neighborhood, nation, or class, and not another, foreign powers, exclusive elites, etc.? Why do the terrorists' personal needs find expression at a particular time during invasions, occupations, etc., and place, locus of imperial power, military and political institutions, mercenary police stations. Obviously, the personal has multiple forms, objects, places, and times for expression. To explain specific political actions, one must examine the political, ideological, and class relations, the state and international configuration of power. The second set of questions is a refinement of the first. Why don't personal needs express themselves in other nonviolent forms of political action, such as running in elections, for example, instead of becoming a guerrilla or suicide bomber, etc.? More specifically, what political obstacles or literal or figurative walls prevented other than violent forms of political action? We can hypothesize that the greater the closure imposed on the political system, colonial and neo-colonial rule, long-term military occupation, racist exclusive ideology and practice, systematic widespread torture of suspects, the greater the degree of uprooting or ethnic purging, the more likely the choice posed by the ruling power is simply subject yourself or revolt. Under such circumstances, there is a greater likelihood of violent resistance, individual or collective. Suicide bombings are a form of individual sacrifice, of individual resistance taken in the name of a collective. In Western society, individual sacrifice to defend the nation in war merits the highest military medals, the Distinguished Medal of Honor, with distinctive military and religious ceremonies. In the Middle East, similar honorific activities accompany the suicide bombers. They are cited as martyrs to the cause of national liberation. Why do the terror experts ascribe pathological behavior to the Middle Eastern resistance fighters and not to their own military heroes who died for the bloody empire? Why is one culture which honors its sacrificial martyrs called civilized and another a fanatical, violent, barbarian culture? This question is especially relevant because throughout history in all nations facing superior arms, organization, and technology from an imperial conqueror, resistance has included sacrificing one's own life in the course of inflicting the highest number of casualties on the enemy. Just think of Leonidas at the pass of Thermopylae, with a few hundred soldiers facing the advancing Persian imperial army. Was he engaged in a form of suicide defense of Athens? Why is it glorious to be the equivalent of a suicide bomber in ancient Greece and not in modern Palestine? History teaches us that there have been and always will be self-sacrificing individuals or collectives, nations, people, etc., still prepared to defend nation and home when faced with superior arms, irrespective of the likely cost. Countries, especially imperial states with superior arms, rarely practice, either individually or collectively, the use of the human body as a missile or weapon. Japanese kamikaze fighters were not used in the conquest of China or the Philippines. This only came into practice when Japan was faced with the superior air and sea power of the US. Terror experts attempt to denigrate the politics of popular resistance by attributing the struggle to the manipulation of ignorant or uninformed followers by leaders with unworthy motives. This overlooks all mass movements, which have, by their nature, a whole range of leaders, activists, and sympathizers, and who face grave personal danger in order to follow them. Terror experts imagine leaders who are in search of money, status, power, jobs, etc. Once the unmasking technique fails to explain obvious facts, overwhelming evidence throughout the world, past and present, demonstrates that those who struggle against a dominant colonial imperial power suffer severe material losses of life, family, jobs, income, houses, and property. In the case of the Palestinians, the Israeli Jews punish the whole extended family, steal personal belongings and heirlooms, and destroy generations of old orchards and cultivated fields. With resistance movements, it is very rare that leaders enrich themselves in the midst of a life and death struggle. Those leaders who do not enrich themselves usually do so after the struggle has ended, especially if they turn to embrace the neo-colonial paymasters of the terror experts. In fact, it is the terror experts' closest collaborators and their informants who enrich themselves by spying and turning in the patriots, whom the experts call terrorists. Repeatedly, the terror experts engage in role reversal, turning the victims into executioners and the executioners into victims. This has been a common ploy used by totalitarian imperialist ideologues to justify the use of force, from the Nazis to the present-day US, European, and Israeli colonialists. To justify their preposterous claims, the terror experts comb the world to find some groups or individual leaders who will fulfill their stereotype and titillate their readers in New York, Tel Aviv, Washington, or London. The terror expert meets a leader, Muslim of course, who just happens to lead a group known for beheading foreigners and for its close alliance with Osama bin Laden. The terror expert has touched all the right buttons to evoke the conditioned response. Only they are the wrong buttons. Millions engaged in violent resistance do not behead foreigners. Only a very small handful, and then under questionable circumstances. The selective vitriolic libeling of a subject prepares the Western reader to accept the emotionally charged imputation of pathological behavior. Harvard academic Jessica Stern provides us with a typical example, almost a parody, of these polemical ejaculations. She describes the purpose of her study as to identify some common themes that might help to explain how violent Islamic nihilism continues to spread beyond the lawless pockets and failed states where terrorists tend to thrive and into the cities of the West. Nihilism presumes no goals, no values, and no alternatives. Most observers would disagree based on a simple reading of most of the Islamic revolutionary or radical websites. They have goals: to replace Western dominance with national Islamic rulers. Their values include both traditional religious and modern variants, and their alternatives to submission are guerrilla, mass, or individual resistance. The neighborhoods, cities, and communities where the putative nihilists originate were far more stable, norm-guided, and law-abiding before the forceful intrusion of imperial and colonial power, which tears asunder the networks that bind collectives. Lawless pockets, to the degree in which they exist, are products of the unwillingness or incapacity of the conquering powers and their proxies to establish a just and stable social order. Moreover, one can observe in many cases that lawlessness is selective. Occupied peoples disobey colonial laws, edicts, or fiats, while abiding by the laws or rules declared by their own legitimate authorities. Moreover, it is generally the case that newly liberated areas run by guerrillas are more lawful than under previous military or colonial occupation with their drugs, brothels, and bars. The notion of, quote, failed states has achieved a certain notoriety among Western pundits, academics, and especially the terror experts. Its exponents use it to describe the collapse of nations that have been devastated by surrogate pro-Western militarists and or pillaged by Western banks under the tutelage and protection of the IMF and the World Bank. No doubt there have been gangster rulers in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the Third World, but they have, more often than not, been trained by Western foundations or universities and send their ill-gotten fortunes to Western, Israeli, or offshore banks. The terror experts, in labeling their former progeny as failed rulers, disown their own offspring. What imperial ideologues mean by failed states is the failure of clients to establish a stable neoliberal regime, necessitating, quote, successful Euro-US imperial intervention to create, quote, prosperous democracies, like in post-invasion Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Haiti, where white slavery, drug trafficking, warlords, and death squads rule with the aid of US helicopter gunships hovering over and firing into unruly neighborhoods. Stern and other verbal assassins strip the victims of their humanity as, quote, nihilists, denigrate their place of birth as, quote, lawless pockets, deny the historical authenticity of their nations as, quote, failed states, all the better to oversee their extermination, their ghettoization in the economically ravaged and unsustainable regions, and their torture. Through the eyes of the terror experts, Euro-US and Israeli bombing of these population centers is seen as doing humanity a great favor. preventing the spread of terrorists into the cities of the West. The shrill anti-Arab/Muslim rhetoric of the terror experts encourages moderate Western politicians to impose more rigid and humiliating administrative and legal measures against Arab, Middle Eastern, and South Asian travelers, immigrants, visitors, religious leaders, academics, and business people. Targeted by and subject to systemic denigration by the West mass media, state functionaries, immigration police, hostile embassy personnel, academic terror experts, the secret police, and special assassination teams, oppressed people are forced to transform themselves to meet a chronic national emergency. Ruler-ruled relations are a series of perpetual impositions, unwelcomed visits by colonial operatives, granted license by the imperial terror experts, purportedly to restore order. Faced with a systemic effort to lower their self-esteem, the oppressed people find themselves in their own organizations, public and clandestine, religious and secular. This reaffirmation finds expression in a reassertion of a religious or secular identity embodied in a mosque, church, political movement, or resistance organization. Colonial/imperial power disrupts the daily routine of the general population. Going to work entails passing through roadblocks, workplaces are destroyed, fruit trees are uprooted. Taking care of the family becomes a daily life and death struggle of securing food at black market prices, facing unpredictable hostile fire in the marketplace. Enjoying leisure becomes a memory of the pre-colonial, pre-imperial past. Now there is forced leisure, jobless, policed, futureless, in the street, where individual discontent is socialized by local opinion leaders who provide a focus for action. Taking sides, addressing the oppression, the hardening of attitudes is a fundamental effort to recover the daily routine. The complex interweaving of powerful spiritual loyalties, family responsibilities, and workplace displacement leads to a commitment to direct action and a political movement. This is a rational and complex process. The terror experts' colonial preconceptions blind them to this reality. For example, Stern sees the committed resistance fighter as being in a kind of trance, irrational, dogmatic, and simplistic. The terror experts repeat ad nauseum that the terrorists join their organizations in their search for strength, a common response of all those who engage in politics and social action. The terror experts turn a common phenomenon, which has a lineage of over 3,000 years or more, into a particular feature of, quote, terrorists. The resistance fighters do have a sense of altruism and an idea of the public good, which the terror experts refuse to take seriously. To do so would require a profound re-examination of their own loyalties and collaboration with imperial/colonial powers, and a deep critical self-examination of their institutional location and motives. This would be a difficult psychological and material experience for the terror experts, since their prestige, income, status, and influence might be threatened. Their critical introspective analysis might lead them to question their paymasters, their institutions, their colonial imperial states, which foundations would pay a renegade terror experts to bear witness to their colleagues' prejudices, falsifications, and close ties to politicians who sanction torture and murder? Would their former colleagues describe the renegade as being in a kind of trance, victim of the Stockholm complex, accepting the views of their captors? The colonial practitioners and their academic experts specialize in verifying each other's stereotypes of resistance fighters. They oversimplify their motives, decisions, and commitments. They rely on blanket categories that obscure deeper structural realities in favor of subjective labeling. Above all, they banish any objectivity. Relations of power and dominance, state violence, violent intrusions into Arab, Muslim, and Latin American countries, towns, and villages are described by the terror experts as defensive or retaliation, as the limbs and body parts of Palestinian babies, women, and grandparents are exploded over the ruins of homes and neighborhoods. Harvey Morris, the Zionist bureau chief of the Financial Times in Israel, rights of Israeli retaliation. Banishing objectivity means the incapacity to empathize with the human condition of the colonized victims. For that reason, the experts must present the victims as subhuman, because the terror experts are condemning the most abused victims in the name of the most vicious powers. They convince themselves that their vitriolic diatribes are merely a service to truth and science. The terror experts have invented a new paradigm: scientific diatribes in the service of intellectual dishonesty. The terror experts are masters of euphemism, especially in dealing with the muck and gore of empire building. Imperialists become one-worlders. Colonial occupation is called nation building. Murderous, sequential, destructive, offensive wars become humanitarian interventions. While the terror experts are the driving force in the change of lexicon, what is remarkable is the extent to which ordinary academics pick it up. Above all, the terror experts celebrate triumphal imperialism. The defeated colonial peoples, we are told, are resentful, those who feel they can't keep up. How is a Palestinian farmer going to keep up with a Jewish settler who seized his land and water and, supported by local thugs and Israeli soldiers acting under government authority, blocks his access to the market? Anything short of resentful would be masochistic. Is it any wonder that the deracinated and dispossessed risk their lives to convert resentment into resistance? By all means. When the tanks roll into Iraqi neighborhoods after shelling homes and mosques, is it any wonder that furious neighbors swarm around an ambushed tank and dance on the shards of smoking metal and corpses? Is it a frightful spectacle of pitiless terrorists, or jubilant neighbors who have silenced the sound of shells bursting over their heads and into their neighbors' homes? The terror experts existed before the Iraqi resistance, and they will exist after it. Wherever the oppressed rise and effectively resist imperial rule, there will be academic chairs, foundation grants, and centers for international studies for the ambitious, upwardly mobile terrorist experts. The imperial state will demand their services, prestigious councils of foreign relations will offer memberships, and universities will reward them with distinguished professorships. They will become celebrities. The mass media talk shows will feature them. They will be far from the killing fields, but their spirit will be there, on the front lines and in the torture chambers, guiding the hands that place the hoods over the unredeemable nihilists, Muslims, Marxists, or national patriots.